Alright, so our next topic we are talking about is friction. The definition of friction is a force that opposes motion between two surfaces that are touching. So any two surfaces that are touching, whether it's solids, liquids, gases, friction is going to occur. And the reason this occurs is because all objects' surfaces are rough. Even the smoothest of surfaces, even ice, it has microscopic grooves in it. If you look at a very microscopic level, you're still going to see some rough spots, and that's why there's friction. Even if it's only a little friction, everything has some kind of friction. And the friction is going to depend on two things. It's going to depend on how rough the surface is, and also what is the measure of the force between the two objects that are creating the friction. So first off, if we create friction, if we have a rougher surface, we're going to have greater friction. So if you are rubbing two pieces of sandpaper together compared to two pieces of just computer paper together, it's a lot more difficult to rub those two pieces of sandpaper past each other because there's more friction. It's rougher. Um, Another thing, if you fall on concrete compared to grass, you're going to tear your knee up a lot more, your skin up on that concrete than you are the grass. And the reason that is because there is more friction between your skin and the concrete than your skin and the grass, because that concrete is rougher compared to the smoother grass, so there's more resistance to that motion. So as your skin moves past that concrete, it wants to resist it from moving, so that's why your skin gets torn off more with that than grass. Also, if you increase the force between the objects, you're going to increase the friction. So if you have two objects that are being pushed together very strongly, it's going to be a lot more difficult to move them past each other, because there's going to be more friction compared to something with less force. So we have four types of friction that we're going to talk about. We have sliding, rolling, fluid, and static. So first off, sliding friction. I think this is the most common type of friction people to think of. This is the reason when you rub your hands together, you can feel the heat. So if you try that now and you rub them together quickly, you're going to feel heat between them because of that friction. If you push any object, such as an eraser, across the desk, that is experiencing sliding friction. If you go sledding, you're experiencing sliding friction. The brakes on your car are examples of sliding friction. Anything, for the most part, that is in motion when you have two solids coming in contact is experiencing sliding friction. So this is what makes sure that all objects, they don't keep moving forever. If you slide a book across your desk, if the desk is big enough, it's going to eventually just stop on the desk. It's not going to just keep moving forever. If you go to slide across the kitchen floor in your socks, you don't keep moving forever. You will eventually stop, and that's because of sliding friction. It's eventually going to slow you down because it's a force that's opposing your motion. The next kind we have is rolling friction, and this is the kind of friction that occurs between a surface and any object that rolls. Now, your book specifically says wheels, but a ball also is an example of rolling friction. So if you kick a ball, eventually it's going to stop, but because of rolling friction. Now, rolling friction is less of a force than sliding friction. So if you kick a soccer ball with the same force that you kick, I don't know, something of equal weight that's just flat. So if you have two objects, one that's round and one that's flat, and they're equal weight, you kick it with equal force, that round object is going to move a lot faster a lot farther before it stops compared to the flat object, because that round object is experiencing rolling friction, whereas the flat object is experiencing sliding friction, which is a lot stronger, which means there's going to be more resistance and a bigger opposition. So that's the reason we use rolling friction in transportation. If you have a vehicle on wheels, it's a lot easier to get around than, if the building didn't have wheels, you're not really going to be able to go that far. And that's the reason the wheels work so well for us in transportation, is because there's less friction with rolling friction. That's the reason also, if you're moving something, like let's say you're moving a dresser, it's going to be a lot easier for you to move that on wheels than just sliding it across. Even though you're moving with you have the same exact weight that you're moving, if there's wheels there, you're now reducing the friction because you switched to rolling friction rather than sliding. Type of friction is fluid friction. So your book specifically says between water and an object. Water is a very main example because it's a very common fluid, but even the air is considered to be a fluid object. So if you move your hand around in the air right now, you'd be able to feel the wind and that resistance of your arm moving. You can feel that because your hand is hitting all the air particles and there's a friction between your hand and the air. So that's a fluid friction. If you're in the pool and you're in a bunch of water and you try to move, the reason it's more difficult to move in there is because you have friction between you and all those water particles. All those water particles are against your body and it's making it more difficult because it's resisting that motion. Um, Fluid friction is also the reason because fluid friction has less friction and less resistance than sliding. It's the reason that if you go to walk on a wet floor, you have a better chance of slipping. So if you are walking on a wet floor and there's going to be fluid friction, so there's going to be less friction happening, which means your foot is more likely to slip because there's not going to be that resistance. So if you have a dry floor, your foot and the floor are resisting pushing against each other, so your foot kind of stays in place. If you have a wet floor, you have a lot less friction going on now because of the fluid friction, so it's going to make it easier for your foot to slide past the floor, and that's what would cause you to slip. So that's the difference between fluid and the sliding friction that we're used to. And our last type of friction is static friction. So static friction is going to be applied when we have an object that is not moving. So the friction that's keeping objects in place is static friction. So if you have a cup sitting on a table, static friction is what's keeping it there. So static friction will be on an object until that object starts moving. So if you have a book sitting on a table, it's going to have static friction until you push it. If you were to try to slide it across the table, it's going to then switch to sliding, and then it would eventually switch back to static once it stopped moving. So static means to not move. So it's when objects are not moving. It's what keeps those in place. So sometimes friction can be harmful. So friction can cause holes in our clothes. So let's say socks, for example, your feet and your shoes are rubbing against your socks, and that's what causes that material to wear down. If you fall down on the concrete, like we said, that's what causes your skin to get torn up because the resistance and motion between the concrete and your skin. Erosion, we have water that wears down our banks because the water in the soil, there's friction between them, and it's what breaks things down. So those are all examples of way that friction can be harmful, but we have ways that we can reduce it. So for one, if you add some kind of lubricant, so like oil, for example, if you add oil, that's why we add oil to our cars, um, because it helps the parts and the mechanics within the car, so that those parts not wear down as quickly. Because as they move against each other, they would wear down. But if we have a lubricant there like oil, it's going to create less friction, which means they're going to wear down less quickly. Also, if you switch from sliding to rolling, so like I said, if you're pushing a dresser, you add wheels, it's going to be a lot less friction, so it's going to make it a lot easier to move. So that gives us less friction. And then also if you just smooth out that surface. So remember, the smoother the surface, the less friction you have. Friction can be harmful, but it can also be useful to us. So if we need to increase the friction, will make the surface rougher, and we can also increase the force between the surfaces like we said before. So ways that friction are helpful, first off, there'd be no way that we could survive without friction. We would have no way to get around if we didn't have friction. We wouldn't be able to walk because our feet would just slip past. Our feet wouldn't ever be able to get a grip on the ground. Our cars would never move because the wheels would just spin. We wouldn't be able to write on a piece of paper because when we write with pencil, it's because the graphite's breaking down against the paper because of friction, and it's leaving the mark behind. Our brakes in our cars work because of friction. Essentially, the world would just not work without friction. But those are just some very main examples of ways in our everyday life that we have to have friction to survive. So if we need to increase the friction, we do things like making the surface rougher and increasing the force between those surfaces.